I'm here today with one of Black Wall Street's most profound musicians, Mr. Washington Rucker. Has played all over the world and has come here today to share just his career with us. There's just so many different highs that you've enjoyed. So tell us where you were born at, Mr. Rucker.
I was born at the top of Greenwood Hill in Miss Holdens's grocery store on the second floor.
In the grocery store, huh?
On the second floor, absolutely.
Okay.
1937.
1937.
Yeah. Then we moved down to Jasper, which is 3 blocks away, and that's where I really saw life for the first time. With Miss Ollie's kids, we lived in the back house at 623 East Jasper. They lived in the front house at 623. We lived in a half. They lived in the front. Miss Ollie had about 10, 12 kids, and among them is Morris Chestnut, who's the father of the actor Morris Chestnut.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Los Angeles, the famous Morris Chestnut.
Yeah, the famous Morris Chestnut. Yeah.
So he has Tulsa roots.
Oh, very strong Tulsa roots.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, tell us about your growing up and what influenced you first musically.
Well, we all, before we went to the old Booker T Elementary School, the band, the parades were the biggest thing that happened on our side of town. You got to realize the fact that I was between 2 and 5 years, before 5 years old.
Okay.
So when the bands came to town marching down Greenwood, man, that was a highlight to our life. That and eating mulberry out of the mulberry tree. So we'd all run to the corner and watch the band, and I used to watch, and I can recall watching the band stop that Greenwood Hill, it's called the Brickyard Hill, by the way, coming down the Greenwood corridor, and it was amazing. And I saw Crazy Red playing drums, and Red worked for Mr. Goodwin, and lived with Mr. Goodwin, and knows Jim when he was a baby.
Okay.
And so yeah, he inspired me to play, and ultimately I picked up a knife, a fork, and a skillet, and I began to play. Yeah.
And that was your first.
That was my first
set of drums.
Pad. Yeah,
drum
first
pad.
set of drums. Yeah,
drum pad.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
I mean, a lot of musicians talk about when their first instrument, and
right,
sometimes it wasn't an instrument.
It wasn't. It's about
an item in the home.
Yeah, right, yeah. And the instruments were, we could barely eat, so, the instrument was totally out of the question. We didn't even have a radio.
Mr. Rucker, if you could talk about Greenwood, Black Wall Street, from 1913 to 1921.
Well, I can talk about, for those are years, I wasn't born then.
Right.
Okay.
What was some of the early music influences, though,
the
that came off of
the early music,
Black Wall Street?
The influences were, for some odd reason, between Tulsa and Muskogee, you had a conglomerate of about probably 40 or 50 musicians. Blues basically solidified in places like Tulsa and Muskogee, and very much like ragtime solidified in, I think, Sedalia, Illinois, or whatever it is. It solidified in places, and when you hear, and I keep telling people, I keep arguing about this, when you hear Kansas City blues, the Kansas City swing, the majority of the musicians came from Oklahoma.
Wow.
And Muskogee, I mean, Jay McShann and I had a long conversation, and he said, yeah, man, he said, I was raised in Muskogee. Charlie Christian played with all those guys, and so many people came out of Oklahoma and then later went to Kansas to form the bands that later were Count Basie's bands, Duke Ellington's band, and people like that. Majority of them came from Oklahoma. And that's always been a mystery. I have not been able to trace it back.
Okay.
Exactly what was it about the music, but I think it was a combination of the blues and the country element,
right,
that gave it a very unique sound, and a unique approach to playing music,
right,
unlike the music of today.
Do you remember some of those musicians that came here, the national musicians
yeah,
that came here?
Jay McShann, who had Charlie Parker in his band.
Right.
Ernie Fields' band became very prominent.
A national band.
But then Oscar Estelle, who came out of Lionel Hampton's band,
Okay.
Oscar brought bebop to Tulsa in about 1951 or 52.
Okay.
He brought bebop, which is a whole another era, another genre of jazz.
Another genre of jazz.
But he brought that to Tulsa.
Okay.
And oh yeah, man, there were so many of them, and I wish I had known because I would have listened.
So, well, that's okay. So, out of that conglomerate of, the 40 or 50 local musicians, some who branched into national bands. Who was the most influential to you out of all of those people?
Mr. Clarence Dixon. Mr. Dixon was Mr. Dixon from 1937 to 1942 was the number 2 drummer in the world, and the number 1 swing drummer in the world was Chick Webb, who had in his band a young version of Ella Fitzgerald.
Okay.
And when Chick died, Ella took the band over. She was one of the first big band leaders. Female was Ella Fitzgerald, took Chick Webb's band, but Mr. Dixon was second to him, and he played with Ernie Fields' band.
Okay.
He inspired me and gave me a belief in myself as a player. He handed me a pair of sticks and said, "This pair of sticks will take you all over the world." And I never sit down to a set of drums, and particularly in Europe, that I don't pay homage to Mr. Dixon. Based on that.
So, what was your first band?
My first band was a band here in town called Jimmy Cry Hawkins and His Teardrops of Joy, and Jimmy was a blues singer, like a lot of guys that just started singing, and he formed a band and he started getting gigs. And my first gig paid $12.
That was good back then.
Oh man, that's a lot of money.
Yeah,
I gave mother $10 and kept $2 in my pocket.
All right.
Oh yeah, I was fat, So that was my first band. In that band was really one of the finest blues guitar players I've ever known that never left Tulsa. His name was Donald Peterson, and he had a brother named Kyle Peterson, and they both did a lot of experimenting with electronic stuff on the guitar.
Okay.
At probably about the same time as Les Paul, who became famous for it.
Very famous.
But Kyle Peterson did the same thing.
So they were playing an electronic
electric guitar.
Yeah.
And that with different effects to
them.
Yeah, way back then, because his brother was experimenting with those effects, and I understand Kyle might be still alive. He got to be 89 or 90. You know.
So you begin to play with Jimmy Cry Hawkins.
Yeah.
And then when do you get your first break out of Tulsa?
When I joined the Navy in 1955.
Okay.
When I graduated from high school, when I graduated from Booker T in 1955, I joined, and a guy saw me playing. He saw me playing in the Navy Drum and Bugle Corps, and told me I should go to the Navy School of Music, but I didn't know the Navy had a School of Music.
Right.
And so ultimately I took an audition, and I passed it, and I got in the Navy School of Music, and there were 13 black musicians in the whole U.S. Navy at the time. So, and it was highly competitive, with the white boys who had lessons and had drum pads where I had a skillet, that sort of thing. So, I came in the third from the bottom of about 75, 80 drummers.
Right.
And I said, well, this is where I want to be. So the best way to do that is practice. And ultimately I got good enough to be appointed to a U.S. experimental band. And I wrote a book called Jazz Road, and in it I have a chapter called Racism Saved My Life, because I was in this band, I was the only black in this band. And ultimately, when they made this a part of the official U.S. Navy band, they took me out and put a white drummer in it, and the whole band got killed.
Wow.
Yeah, in 1961.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
So then you come out of the Navy, of course.
I came out of the Navy in 1959 and moved to Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And, my wife at the time insisted that I either get a job or she didn't want me to play music.
You was a starving artist?
Yeah, very much, very much. But I got a job at the post office.
Okay.
And then,
that's a good job.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's what it was then,
Yeah.
And so I sort of, with music, kept drawing me back to it.
Right.
And ultimately, I made a rehearsal one night, and the drummer, only opportunity is when somebody moves and you
Right.
slide in that slot. And a drummer didn't show up to a rehearsal, and I ended up playing the music. And one of the guys in the band, an alto saxophone player, who knew some people here from Tulsa that was in the Army band, he saw me, and he had the band at the famous Howard Theater. And the Howard Theater was one of those, it was really the top of the line. It was like the black version of Carnegie Hall.
Right.
And there were 5 theaters like that. You had the Apollo Theater in New York City. You had the Royal Theater in Baltimore, the Howard Theater in D.C., the Chicago. You had the Regal, and in Philadelphia you had the can't think of the name of the theater. But I was in that band, and that's a really prestigious gig, because every act known to me, because blacks could only play those black.
Right.
Things.
Was that the Chitlin Circuit considered
Well,
to be?
that was just above the Chitlin Circuit.
Right
Once
above
you got
the
to the
Chitlin
Howard,
Circuit.
the people in Chitlin Circuit hone their crafts and like going down to the school, you're playing in the barn.
Right.
And ultimately they try to make it to the Howard.
Well, what I've learned from a lot of musicians is sometimes, to get your chops right, your timing right, it's good to play in small rooms.
Oh, absolutely.
That's a craft that just has to be respected.
Right, it does. And you can't write it on a piece of paper. That's the biggest mistake to make, because, in particular with black music, the magic comes within the person at that time. And a lot of times, and I've had philosophical conversations and differences based on the fact that, man, you should have done. No, I should have done exactly what I did,
right? Because
that's what dictated me to do that at that time. You can't lock it in and package it like you do at Walmart,
Right. So now you've gone from Booker T to Greenwood to Howard to Washington, D.C. And there's an award that you received there also, right? Or you have a brick?
On the Howard University Walk of Fame.
Walk of Fame?
Yeah, I'm one of the, I got a brick there as one of the musicians that they honored there.
Right. What are some of the names of the musicians that you met at the Howard Theater?
Everybody from Jackie Wilson. I played with Pigmeat Markham there. I played with Mom's Mabley, a younger version of Mom's Mabley. Butterball and Skillet. Those people. There was a thing called the show that came through here called the Jewel Box Review. Had the finest music I've ever played. All of the Motown acts, when it was called the Motortown Review, it wasn't called Motown.
It's Motortown.
It was called the Motortown Review, and they had one station where they had one old bus like Mr. Fields used to have.
Right. And
every particular act that was known, because when you got to the Howard, you at the top of the heap.
Right. So tell us, how do you, now that you're in D.C., you're in a good place, and how do you end up in Europe?
I left eventually in 1966, I think, 66. I left and I went to California. A lady told me, she said, "Man, you belong in California, you should be an actor." And yeah, right. And she was the old lady that used to be, it was an old lady that was from Kansas. I think she's from Topeka, Kansas. And she actually saw me one time. She said, you shouldn't be delivering mail. You belong in California. So I moved to, I was having problems with my marriage.
Right.
So I moved to California, and I took a pool cue. I didn't take the drums. I took a pool cue. I figured I'd do something else, and I just going to hustle pool.
Yeah.
And then eventually I brought my set of drums out and began to play around locally. And a guy heard me play, and who knew Oscar Still and the rest of them from Duke Ellington's band, and the Marshall Royal and his brother Ernie Royal. They were the anchors for Duke Ellington and Count Basie's band, and they were from Sapulpa.
Okay.
And I was playing with them, so he asked me did I want to play with Stevie Wonder, and they didn't pay no money, man.
Right.
I could have made more money.
Now, what year was that? Was that 60?
67, 68.
Okay.
And
by the way, I'm 3 years old then, but go ahead.
Is that right? Yeah, I was 60.
Yeah, well, I was born in '64, so
Right.
I'm, you know.
Oh, yeah, right.
I'm a puppy.
Yeah,
But go
right.
ahead,
Yeah, but it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I joined. They called me and I turned down the money because they wanted to pay me $200 a week. Man, I said no. And out of that, you had to eat, sleep, and whatever else you wanted to do. You know.
Right.
So we ultimately ended up settling on $450 a week.
Okay.
And that was better than nothing, you know. So
Right.
I got on a plane and went to North Carolina, got off the plane, went straight to the bandstand. Never seen Stevie, never seen the music before,
Right.
and played it. And
Right.
and then Stevie was going to Europe about a month later, and I didn't even audition, just played the music and off to Europe. And that was my first trip to
and
Europe.
That was your first trip to Europe. So you lived in Europe for
a long time.
For a long time.
Right. And I kept an apartment over there for, I don't know, 15 years or more.
Okay.
Over 15 years in Switzerland. Because I found Switzerland to be the place. That in the south of France.
Right.
And I settled on Switzerland because they spoke more English than they did in the south
Right.
of France. And took me a long time to learn what little French I knew.
Right.
You know.
So how many records did you start first publishing your own record in Europe? Is that the first time you put a record out?
My first album, my first, actually the only one I've got probably 35 or 40 songs, but the first and only album I did was published in Switzerland.
Okay.
And one of the tricks that a lot of musicians did was to get a lot of records printed up over here, take them to Europe and sell them. You sometimes triple what you would make normally.
Okay.
And I did the same thing. You know, the first time I took about 500 albums, and I made more money off those albums than I did playing music.
Right.
You know, from then on, that began. I'd always take a box of albums,
Right.
A suitcase full of albums, and sell them.
Right. And so you enjoy a wonderful life in Europe.
Yeah.
You play with some of Europe's most famous.
Yeah, I played with a lot of the famous black artist Ben Webster. I don't know that from Muskogee.
Uh-huh.
Ben Webster. I played with him at probably the most famous club in all of Europe, and the oldest club is called Montmartre.
Okay.
And it's in Copenhagen, and I was in Copenhagen with Nancy Wilson.
Okay.
And for 6 weeks, and I played there with Ben Webster and Wilbur Little, the bass player that I knew in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And because Amsterdam was a place that they call it the graveyard for American jazz musicians, because a lot of musicians would go there and live until they died.
Live, right, yeah.
Chet Baker died in Amsterdam.
Musician from the States. From the
Yeah,
United
he's here
States.
from York, Oklahoma.
From York, Oklahoma.
Yeah,
Wow.
and
okay.
so that was my thing. I got an opportunity to play with and Dexter Gordon. And we did about a month worth of playing for Radio Free Europe. At that time, jazz was used as a political arm of the propaganda machine we had insofar as democracy was in the United States behind the Iron Curtain.
Okay.
They would play music, and then talk about how great it is to be an American in the whole bit, or how great democracy
is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm on a lot of those, probably
Right.
24 of those. I mean, I don't know, several years ago, I went to Romania and I was being interviewed on the radio station, and a woman promptly went to her drawer and pulled out a cassette, something your generation would know about the cassette. Yeah. And there
you were. Huh?
Yeah.
Wow. So there's just so much that you've accomplished and done.
Mm-hmm.
So then eventually you come back to the United States and you become a music teacher at UCLA.
Yeah. Well, I first started. I first went to UCLA. I wanted to get myself a college degree. I've always wanted to get a degree.
Yeah.
And I'd gone up to North Dakota State to play at a big weekend jazz convention with the very famous piano player Hampton Hawes. He's probably the greatest jazz player ever to come out of the West Coast. And I was up there with him, and the professor at the university, North Dakota State, asked me if I would stay up as a jazz teacher. I said, I don't know enough about the music, I knew enough about the music, but I didn't have any form, and I didn't want to get up there and just start telling stories about blah, blah, blah. So I said, I need to get myself a degree. That way I can articulate more about the music,
right,
and have something to say about people. Because unfortunately, a lot of musicians don't do that, and they leave it to others to do it, and their stories are never really told. Because, like I said, there's a reason why, if let's say I'm playing, there's a reason why I play something at a particular time that doesn't have anything to do with what's on the paper.
right,
And that's an effort to legislate or to control the music.
right.
So I went to UCLA, and the professor of jazz studies only called the roll one time. And when he got to my name, he said, Washington Rucker. I said, yeah. He said, you're on album called The Trumpet Kings with Dizzy Gillespie and Roy L. I said, yeah. He said, come down. You know, and I went down. He said, hey, man, it's good to meet you. What are you doing here? I said, I need to get a degree, man. You know? So his wife was sick.
Okay.
And he began to call me, like he called at 4 o'clock in the morning. He said, hey, man, I can't go in today. Can you go in and teach my class?
Right.
So eventually I did, and I was the finalist of 3 people to become professor of jazz studies. You know, and I would have only had a bachelor's degree, so they nixed me. But they, as a consolation prize, they gave me the School of Extension.
Okay.
So I taught at the School of Extension 3 years, but I would still lecture at UCLA and ultimately at USC.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, bringing it all into where we are now, we are so happy that you're a part of 1921,
Mm-hmm.
The Black Wall Street Music Project.
Mm-hmm.
I let you listen to a couple of songs the other day. What do you think about music now?
Well, you know, music is I think, well, I have to be honest about it. I think music has basically lost its soul.
Right.
And the reason why, because the music doesn't have any, music was, at that time, was created through personal experiences, personal tragedies and all that. Now it's created by a machine.
Right.
And when you can punch a button and make you cry, you know, that's different from if I sing a lyric in a song and make you cry.
Speaking of machines, you talked earlier to us about the drums.
The drum machine.
And the kids in L.A. buying an 808 when it was actually that sound, that deep bass sound,
Right, yeah.
was invented by you?
Well, I can't say who it was put in a machine called the Simmons machine.
The Simmons machine.
Which was the first drum machine that I know of.
Right.
And they myself, James Gatson, Paul Humphrey, Earl Palmer, all of these were studio guys. And they had them play like they did me. Had me play for an hour, and they just put all this stuff in the machine.
All the different sounds in the machine.
And all the various sounds. I mean, I've seen the machine, and I've gone in to do some of my music. And the guy said, man, where do you want the drums to come from? The 5th row of Carnegie Hall or the bandstand with 8 musicians over here and maybe nobody down there? And they've done all that through this machine.
Right.
But that doesn't have anything to do with the humanism, the humanistic part of music per se.
Okay.
You know, and of course the drummers picked up the speed. That's playing 20 times faster than I ever thought I could play.
Right.
You know, and so.
Well, that's the digital era.
Well, no. There's a. Let me stop you for a second.
Was that still
analog? Guys do that stuff. Is a man named Moeller. He's a German guy that invented a style of playing where you don't play with your wrist like I play, but you play with your fingers. And all these guys who are in these church bands, some of the most fantastic and fastest drummers I've ever heard are coming right out of these churches.
Come out of church.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, one thing about the African American church is that we've, so many singers and musicians come out of that.
Oh, yeah. That's the foundation of whatever we do, man.
Right. Yeah, that's the foundation of it. Well, Mr. Rucker, we want to thank you for, sharing. I mean, that's just so much. It'll take us a couple of days to get to everything that you've accomplished and you've done. We're looking forward to using some of your music for our upcoming 1921 Black Wall Street Music Project.
Beautiful. Thank you.
We've had several conversations, and we've got some other things on the horizon. So you're gonna get around on the drums a little bit for us and show us some old school taps.
I move slow because I'm old.
Teach these youngsters. You gonna teach these youngsters something new?
Yeah.
Something old that's new. That's new.
Yeah, right.
Something old that's really new.